Today we're going to talk about what happened to the anime of the 90s. Or rather, why are the anime of the 90s considered to be better? We're not going to talk so much about, so to speak, the decline of the industry, but rather what the anime of the past had that made them so special. We're going to talk about the context in which they were born, their art, their themes, and also the contrast with the current industry, because understanding the past also helps us value or question the present. To understand why the anime of the 90s were so different, we first had to go back to the historical moment in which they were born. Japan had just experienced one of its most optimistic eras in the 1980s. The economy was booming, businesses were growing non-stop, and the country saw itself as a technological and cultural giant. But that momentum didn't last forever. In the early 1990s, the economic bubble burst, and Japan entered a long crisis that is now known as the Lost Decade. And this was no small feat. The entire country fell into a state of uncertainty, social depression, and loss of direction. Unemployment rose, promises of prosperity disappeared, and an entire generation began to question their place in the world. This climate not only affected the economy but also art, and anime was no exception. Many of the most iconic anime of the 90s were born as an emotional or philosophical response to this social collapse. Evangelion is probably the best example. Beyond the Evas and the fights, it is a deeply existentialist work, plagued by emotional emptiness, depression, and personal trauma. It's no coincidence that its creator went through a real depression while writing it. It was a reflection of a broken generation searching for meaning in a world that seemed to no longer have any. We also had anime like Lain, which dealt with the impact of new technologies and isolation. Perfect Blue, which explored the loss of identity in a world of appearances. Even more accessible anime, so to speak, like Cowboy Bebop, had a melancholic tone full of broken characters, escaping from a past that constantly haunted them. The 90s were a time when anime absorbed the real concerns of contemporary Japan and that gave it a very different depth than what came after. There was a sense of a gray world of anxiety, of the protagonists being trapped in systems they didn't understand, but that they had to deal with anyway. Now let's move on to the technological plane, which also had a huge impact on how anime was made at that time. In the 90s, digital animation was not yet the standard. Most anime was made using the animation, that is, by hand-painting each animation cell onto transparent acetate. This process was slower, more expensive, and more artisanal, but it also produced a very different visual result. The colors were not as bright as today's, but they had a warmer, more organic texture. The imperfections of the hand-drawn lines gave each shot character. Even the noise of the scan, that visual grain that looks old, helped to generate a different atmosphere. Also, since making the anime was more expensive and demanding, there were not 50 or 60 series produced per season, as is the case today. This forced studios to focus on more solid, more thoughtful, and more personal projects. There was time to develop unusual ideas. Not everything had to aim for massive success or be an adaptation of a popular manga. There was room for originality. Another important detail is that the role of the individual creator had more weight. They weren't products made by committees seeking to satisfy niche markets. They were personal visions, sometimes even conflicting or contradictory, but with a clear identity. Nowadays, anime production is much more dominated by marketing decisions and market research, and that inevitably conditions the type of story that is told. Even from a technical perspective, there were limitations that pushed creativity. Since they couldn't animate many complex sequences, directors resorted to techniques such as long shots, the use of shadows, symbolic compositions, or silences full of tension. What some today may see as a lack of budget was an intelligent aesthetic choice to convey emotions without relying on constant movement. One of the most powerful elements of 90s anime was its personality, its sense of identity, of a unique approach, even when it touched on traditional genres. The works of that era didn't seem mass-produced or follow repeated formulas. On the contrary, each anime felt like a project with its own voice, a work born from a specific vision, sometimes even incomprehensible to the casual viewer. And that wasn't a mistake. It was the essence of an industry where there was still room for experimentation, unlike the current landscape, where a large part of the anime is born as adaptations of already popular mangas or light novels. In the 90s, there was still a culture of original creation. Many anime were born from scratch, as ideas from directors, screenwriters, or studios who wanted to tell something different. Cases like Lain, Uteno, anime that were slow, dense, visually unusual, but absolutely unique. And that creative risk was precisely what gave them value. The interesting thing is that this originality applied not only to the plot or visual style, but also to the tone and atmosphere. Many works from the 90s took their time. They had silences, long shots, introspective characters. They weren't worried about hooking you from the first minute. They didn't need to do everything possible to hold your attention. There was a confidence in the story. If you wanted to follow it, fine, and if not, it was your decision. That is unthinkable today in a context where algorithms and audience retention dominate even the narrative structure of many products. Furthermore, the characters of the 90s were built on contradiction. They were neither perfect heroes nor cartoonish villains. They were broken, doubtful, incomplete individuals. Lane didn't even know who he was. Spite was anchored to the past, fleeing from a duel that he knew was inevitable. They were characters who didn't seek to be cute or marketable. They were human, and that, despite all their contradictions, connected them. It is also important to understand that in the 90s, anime was not yet in the industry geared towards the global market. There was not the same level of exportation or pressure to please international audiences. That allowed the works to focus more on Japanese culture, its codes, and its narrative time. There was no need to, so to speak, translate to foreign tastes. That freedom provides more authentic content without any filters. And as we mentioned, we cannot leave the creators behind. Many anime from the 90s are remembered not only for their stories, but for who was behind them. And it wasn't just about entertaining. They wanted to make people reflect and give contradictory emotions, to give us works that perhaps didn't have clear morals, but forced you to think, and that was the intention. But today, productions are shaped by a production committee that includes toy companies, distributors, publishers, and streaming platforms. Obviously, that doesn't mean there aren't good ideas, because there are some, but it does mean that creative decisions have to go through many filters before reaching the viewer, and in that process, the most valuable thing, the original voice, is lost. Finally, it's worth mentioning that the diversity of genres and approaches in the 90s was surprising for a smaller industry. There was room for cyberpunk, psychological drama, Nordic, melancholic slice of life, absurdist fare, or even pure experimentation. Today, while we have far more anime released each year, most of them end up fitting into tried and true molds. From romantic short stories to fantasy without protagonists, all with slight variations but the same underlying structure. What's missing isn't production, it's simply narrative viewership. One thing that 90s anime fans notice almost immediately is the visual aesthetic. Whether you watched the anime at the time or discovered it decades later, there's something about the way it looks that's impossible to fully replicate. And it's not just nostalgia or VHS grit. It's about a different way of understanding art, direction, and the use of visual language. As mentioned, during the 90s, digital animation had yet to completely replace traditional animation. Mostly anime was made using C animation, a slow, expensive, and demanding artisanal process, but the result was a unique texture. The color palettes were more muted, not due to a lack of quality, but rather an aesthetic decision that suited the narrative tone. Backgrounds were hand-painted with visible brushstrokes, and there was none of the excess brightness or saturation that is used today to draw attention. A simple sunset could have warm, soft hues without the need for computer effects. Added to that is another important element, visual rhythm. Anime wasn't obsessed with showing constant movement. They knew when to stop. We had long shots, slow transitions, silence was used as a narrative device, and stillness wasn't a mistake. It was part of the language. Today, with the pressure of holding attention every second, these types of scenes are cut short or not written at all. Then there's the expressive use of drawing. Hand-drawn lines made the characters more irregular, dirtier, if you will, but also more human. There wasn't the technical perfectionism that software has today. Faces didn't always have exact proportions, lines looked vibrant, imperfections were part of the style, and we must also mention the use of lighting and shadows, which were essential in the 90s. Scenes weren't filled with uniforms. Contrast was used instead. This not only provided visual depth, but also helped convey emotions. In Berserk, many key scenes took place in the dark with shadows partially covering the faces. And this wasn't due to a lack of budget. It was an aesthetic decision to highlight the emotional darkness of the characters. The artistic direction also showed an interest in creating coherent universes, even if they were small. Cowboy Bebop didn't just have a brutal design in terms of ships or cities. Each planet had its own architectural style, way of dressing, and music. Nothing felt generic. Everything seemed designed to make the world habitable. Even the opening and ending themes were part of that visual identity. In the 90s, openings weren't always recycled sequences from anime, nor did they feature obligatory fan service. Some were artistic pieces. Lain opened with symbolic shots and a depressing song. Evangelion opted for a mix of scientific images, biblical texts, and flashes without context. They didn't give you the information chewed up. They suggested it and left you with questions. The mystery was part of the charm. And today, although there are productions with a very high technical level, the visuals become standardized. The faces look similar to each other, the backgrounds are repetitive, the color palettes are generic. Yes, we have more resolution, more frames per second, more digital effects, but less identity. Unanimous from the 90s could be recognized by a single image, but be careful. As we mentioned, it's not that there aren't good works or that there isn't beauty. Mob Psycho, Sony Boy showed that there is still room for the experimental, but the dominant aesthetic is designed to go viral, to be attractive in short clips, and that inevitably limits the visual risk. When we say that the anime of the 90s were better, we can't ignore a key factor: time. The passage of time not only changes how we remember a given time, but also which times we remember, and that has a huge impact on the general perception of that era. The reality is that of the hundreds of anime that came out in the 90s, we only remember the best. The mediocre, generic, or failed works were forgotten. Meanwhile, titles like Evangelion, Berserk, Trigun, Lain, or Perfect Blue survived and became benchmarks. This creates an illusion of constant quality, as if an entire decade had been full of masterpieces, when in reality what we did, consciously or not, was filter out the good and discard the rest. This phenomenon occurs in all forms of art. The same can be said of 70s cinema or 80s music. It's not that there wasn't any garbage, it's just that what survives over time is usually what was truly worthwhile, and that creates a selective memory where everything seems better than it was. But at the same time, it's also true that the value of a work grows over time, not just because it's remembered, but because it matures with the viewer. Many 90s anime, especially the more introspective or existential ones, weren't easy to digest as teenagers, but years later, when watching them again, they take on a whole new meaning. The questions they raised, the emotions they portrayed, resonate more strongly the more life experience one has. Besides, there's something that's not often mentioned. 90s anime weren't designed to be consumed quickly. They weren't watched with automatic subtitles or at double speed. They were broadcast weekly on television or were available on VHS or DVD. Watching them required patience, effort, and even luck if you lived outside of Japan. And that's exactly what made each anime more impactful, because watching it implied a commitment. But today we have access to thousands of series simultaneously, just a click away, and that oversaturation dilutes the experience. And obviously we can't ignore the emotional factor. For many, 90s anime came to us at a formative stage, during childhood or adolescence, and that made them more than just anime. They were life companions, emotional refuges, and first doors to complex issues that weren't discussed in other media. When an anime becomes part of someone's story, it can no longer be seen with just the eyes, it is seen with the soul. And that's why it's difficult for a new work, no matter how good, to generate the same impact. Time doesn't just idealize, it also deepens. It helps us understand why certain stories stayed with us, while others disappeared. And although it's true that memory can be selective, it's also true that what survives does so for a reason. So far we've talked about the historical context of the aesthetics, narrative style, and authorial identity that characterized 90s anime, but all of this becomes more powerful when we contrast it with what's happening in the anime industry today. It's not about saying all the bad things, but rather understanding what has changed and how those changes have affected the types of works produced today. For starters, the number of the anime produced per season has skyrocketed. In the 90s, a season might have about 15 or 20 anime, but today we have more than 60 per quarter. This overproduction has consequences. While it may seem like a positive thing, it means that resources are spread across more projects, production times are reduced, and overall quality drops. Most studios work with ridiculous deadlines, low salaries, and insufficient staff, and it shows. Even good anime ideas can suffer from technical limitations or lack of direction. In addition, current anime is much more dominated by market logic. Most anime exist as part of a chain of commercial exploitation. They are adaptations of manga, light novels, games, or franchises with merchandising potential. The goal is not just to tell a story, but to sell figures, gacha, collaborations, or mobile games. Of course, this is not necessarily a bad thing. The industry has to sustain itself, but it does condition the type of stories that are allowed. Many times what we see is not what the author wanted to tell, but what the production committee approved because it was safe. And that leads to a large part of current anime looking similar to each other. Fantasy worlds with odd protagonists, rom-coms with fan service, and romances that don't progress. Of course there are exceptions, but the formula is repeated over and over again because it works in terms of immediate consumption. And while we're talking about immediate consumption, the narrative rhythm. In the 90s, many anime took their time to build atmospheres, characters, and plots. Nowadays, with the rise of streaming, the pressure to hook the viewer from the first second is constant. If an anime doesn't captivate in the first episode, many abandon it, and that forces studios to build stories that prioritize quick impact over depth. The script is no longer structured to tell a long-term story, but to optimize audience retention. Story takes a backseat to narrative efficiency. There's also the issue of aesthetics. As we mentioned, current animation tends to be more fluid and shiny with digital effects, lights, particles, and fast movements, but it often feels too clean, too perfect, even empty. There's a visual homogeneity that flattens the emotional impact. Even when everything looks good, little is felt. Anime becomes more of a product than an artistic expression, and it's not just about the form, but also the content. They build colorful worlds, endearing characters, and plots that avoid real pain, not because there's a lack of talent, but because the system discourages risk. It's more profitable to entertain than to confront, and yet there is a paradox. There have never been so many resources, so many talented animators, so many fans around the world. The globalization of anime is total. There are anime funded by Netflix, Crunchyroll, and Amazon. There are artists pushing the boundaries of modern animation, but despite that, creative freedom seems less. The final product looks better but feels less. There are valuable anime back. They all had unique elements and proposed something different, but the difference is that today they are the exception, not the norm. In the 90s, many of those strange and risky proposals were not niche products. They were part of the heart of the industry. They were not made, so to speak, but because it was natural, and that is the biggest difference between then and now.